My name is Marin. Standing in the middle of our crowded ranch, I stared at the heavy leather ledger my father just shoved into my hands. Its pages looked so pristine, yet they carried a crushing debt I never owed. And the end of my freedom. It's terrifying how a few drops of ink can chain you to a life you never chose. An hour ago, I might have screamed at him for humiliating the man I love. But now, staring at the predated signature line at the bottom, I realized this wasn't just an insult. It was a trap. Standing there with that heavy ledger in my hands, the silence in the room ringing in my ears, I realized something. Being backed into a corner by my own blood wasn't new to me. It was just the loudest version of what had always been happening. Since I was a kid, I was the designated problem solver, the one expected to just understand. If something went wrong, I had to be the bigger person. I spent my whole life fixing mistakes I didn't even make. Blair, my sister, she lived in a completely different reality. She was protected. If she wrecked a car or drained a credit card, my parents explained it away for her. She was handed a second chance before the dust even settled on her first mistake. Favoritism in a family doesn't start with massive betrayals. No one ever sits you down at the kitchen table and announces who the favorite is. It happens quietly. It's just a quick defense when she tells a lie, a blind eye when she breaks a rule. A certain look my father gave her when she walked into a room, soft, patient, proud, a look I never once received. Day by day, year by year, those tiny moments stacked up. They didn't just hurt my feelings. They built an entire system. A quiet, invisible set of rules where Blair was the prize to be guarded, and I was just a shock absorber for her mess. I used to think if I just worked harder, if I just fixed one more problem, they would finally look at me the same way. But looking at that signature line, it finally clicked. You can never win a rigged game. Because the system wasn't broken. It was working exactly the way they designed it. My father didn't stop at the ledger. He dropped his pen, turned his attention away from me, and locked his eyes on Rhett. He pointed a finger right at his chest. And as for you, you don't belong in this room. My father's voice echoed across the hall. He called Rhett's work dirty, called him a scavenger who was just trying to latch onto our family name. You have dirt under your fingernails. My father sneered. You are nothing but cheap labor. I looked around the room. Dozens of guests, family friends, business partners, they just stood there holding their champagne flutes. Nobody said a word. Nobody stepped in. The silence was their agreement. But right at that moment, my father made his fatal error. He was so focused on humiliating us that he didn't notice an older gentleman stepping out from the back of the crowd. It was Mr. Sterling, the main investor my parents had been desperately trying to impress all night. Mr. Sterling walked right past my father, extended his hand, and looked straight at Rhett. Mr. Hayes, I didn't expect to see you here. My board is still waiting for your final approval on the Valley acquisition. The clinking of glasses stopped completely. My father's smug smile froze. My mother slowly lowered her drink. The man they had just called cheap labor, the man they tried to publicly destroy, was the exact buyer holding the keys to their entire financial future. A lot of toxic family systems don't collapse because they are wrong. They collapse because they get too comfortable and decide to be confidently wrong in front of too many witnesses. I walked out of the main house before my father could even process what had just happened. The night air felt freezing against my face, but my mind was completely clear. The next morning, I sat at a diner on the edge of town with Naomi. She was an old college roommate who now worked in corporate auditing. We spread every financial document, ledger copy, and tax return I could get my hands on across the sticky table. I slid the debt agreement they tried to force on me toward her. Naomi traced her pen along the bottom edge and tapped a string of tiny printed numbers. A digital watermark. The document had been drafted, reviewed by a lawyer, and finalized 2 whole months before I even packed my bags to move back to the ranch. They had not just asked for my help in a panic, they had engineered a trap. But Naomi wasn't done. She pulled a thin gray folder from her bag and placed a single bank statement right in the center of the table. It was an account I had never seen before. It wasn't listed in the ranch's official financial reports. It was completely hidden from the creditors. I stared at the bold numbers at the bottom of the page. The balance was massive. It was more than enough to pay off the immediate debt and save the ranch from foreclosure entirely. I looked up at the account title. It was a restricted trust, locked and designated solely for Blair's future business ventures. My mother and father had the money to save our family home this entire time. They just refused to use it. They would rather manipulate me into a lifetime of crippling debt than touch a single cent of my sister's safety net. That was the moment I knew this wasn't a family in crisis anymore. It was a deliberately biased system. They weren't drowning. They were just deciding exactly who to throw overboard so their favorite child could stay dry. 2 weeks later, the mail carrier handed me a thick, certified letter. The return address was the county clerk's office. I ripped it open right there in the driveway. It was the final notice of foreclosure for the ranch. I walked inside, dropped the papers on my kitchen counter, and stared at the bold red ink stamped across the top. I knew exactly what they had done. I had seen the hidden trust account with Blair's name on it. I knew they orchestrated my debt. And still, I picked up my car keys. I didn't go back because they deserved it. I didn't drive 2 hours back to that property to save the day or to finally earn a single ounce of their respect. I went back for me. When family uses guilt to maintain power, they don't need to put you in physical chains. They just hijack your conscience. They wire your brain from childhood to believe that if their ship sinks, it is entirely your fault for not bailing water fast enough, even when they are the ones drilling the holes. I needed to stand in that house one last time. If I just ignored the notice and disappeared, I knew exactly what would happen. 10 years down the line, I would wake up in the middle of the night carrying the heavy weight of a what if. I needed to know, with absolute certainty, that leaving them to their fate was the only logical option. I parked on the gravel driveway. The heavy oak front doors were wide open. My father was pacing violently in the foyer, shouting into his cell phone. My mother sat perfectly still in her leather armchair, staring blankly at the floor. Blair, of course, was nowhere in sight. People think that going back to a toxic environment means you are weak. It doesn't. Sometimes you go back just to put a permanent lock on a door inside your own mind. I stepped over the threshold, crossed my arms, and just watched them. I needed to see exactly who they chose to be when the absolute worst finally arrived. I placed a single typed contract on the coffee table. I will handle the bank negotiations, I told them, but I need total control over every financial asset, including Blair's restricted trust. My father immediately stiffened. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a freshly printed spreadsheet, carefully sliding it over the actual bank notices. "We went ahead and consolidated the numbers for you," he said. I glanced at the bottom line. He had already altered the debt ratio to keep Blair's money completely untouched. My mother leaned forward and gently grabbed my wrist. "Marin, we are just so sorry for everything that was said at the party," she whispered. But her eyes kept darting to the foreclosure notice. It wasn't a real apology. It was a transaction. They only knew how to say sorry when they needed my signature to survive. I stared at the doctored numbers. I looked at the empty velvet chair where Blair was supposed to be sitting. They hadn't learned a thing. The house was quite literally crumbling around them, and they were still playing the exact same game. I didn't yell. I didn't point a finger at the missing zeros. I just slowly pulled my arm away from my mother's grip. I folded my contract, put it back into my bag, and stood up. People think that setting a boundary requires a massive, explosive reaction. It doesn't. A real boundary is just the quiet moment you decide to stop participating in a broken loop. I didn't argue with them. I didn't explain the math. And for the first time in my entire life, I just turned around and refused to save them. 3 weeks later, the bank officially locked the gates of the ranch. The grand alliance my father had spent months trying to build fell apart before the foreclosure ink was even dry. Mr. Sterling completely pulled his investments the morning after the party, taking his money and his network with him. My parents tried to spin the narrative naturally. They told our extended family and the local country club that I was the ungrateful daughter who abandoned them in their darkest hour. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself or post some long emotional statement trying to clear my name. Instead, I just went back to the local print shop. I made copies of the debt ledger they had tried to force on me, making sure the timestamp from 2 months prior was perfectly visible. Then I attached copies of the hidden trust account with Blair's name on it. I mailed those thick envelopes to my uncle, to our closest neighbors, and to the remaining business partners my father was desperately trying to cling to. No angry letters attached, no explanations, just paper, numbers, and facts they could not deny. The truth doesn't need a loud voice to win. It doesn't require a screaming match or a dramatic confrontation in a crowded room. You don't have to force people to believe you right away. It just needs to exist long enough in the light, and eventually, the lies simply run out of shadows to hide in. I didn't drive away from the ranch feeling angry. I didn't feel a sudden rush of victory or some grand sense of revenge either. As I watched the property fade in my rearview mirror, I just felt done. I left with a completely new set of rules. Helping your family is not a bad thing. What's wrong is helping to the point where they see your sacrifice as a mandatory obligation. There are times in life when the only right move you can make is to simply step aside. You don't argue. You just let the inevitable consequences happen. I didn't walk away to punish my parents or to teach my sister a lesson. I walked away to stop the loop. I had to break the cycle so it wouldn't consume the rest of my life. You are never responsible for repairing a system that was specifically built to use you. I have a quiet life now, far away from those ledgers and that family name. But I still think about that empty signature line sometimes. What would you have done if your own family handed you the pen?